The complete story of Gandalf explained. LOTR. Lore. There is a moment in the mines of Moria that most people have watched a dozen times without understanding what they were actually seeing. An old man in a grey robe stands on a narrow bridge above a chasm that has no bottom. Behind him, 11 companions he has guided across half a world. In front of him, something ancient and terrible, a creature of fire and shadow that was already old when the mountains were young. And the old man does not run, he does not falter. He drives his staff into the stone and speaks words that are not a spell, not a battle cry, but a declaration of jurisdiction. You shall not pass. Not a plea, not a gamble, a statement of fact, delivered by someone who has, for one terrible lucid moment, remembered precisely what he is. What you were watching was not a wizard protecting his friends. You were watching a divine being, a Maya of Valinor, of the same spiritual order as Sauron, as the Balrogs themselves, finally permitting himself a single instant of unveiled authority. An authority he had spent 2,000 years deliberately suppressing. Here is what nobody has actually told you about Gandalf. Not the full thing, not the thing that changes every scene he is in, every choice he makes, every firework, every riddle, every seemingly casual detour through the Shire. Tolkien was not writing a wizard. He was writing something far stranger, far more deliberate, and far more costly. He was writing the story of a divine being who accepted the limitation of mortality, the veil of partial forgetting, and 2 millennia of slow, patient work among creatures smaller and shorter-lived than his own most fleeting thought. Because the Valar had learned, at terrible cost, that you cannot force a world to be free. You can only light a fire and trust that the ones who need it most will find their way to the warmth. This is not speculation pulled from nowhere. This is what the text actually says when you follow it all the way down, through unfinished tales, through the Silmarillion, through the letters, through the history of Middle-earth, through appendices that most readers skim and scholars argue about in footnotes. Follow it all the way down, and what you find is not a fantasy novel's supporting character with good timing. What you find is one of the loneliest, most disciplined, most theologically precise acts of love in all of fiction. So, where does it begin? Not in the Shire. Not at the doors of Bag End on a morning in late spring with fireworks in a cart and smoke rings in the air. It begins before the world had a shape, before there was stone to carve a bridge from, or shadow to fear in the deep places beneath it. It begins with a name you almost certainly have never said aloud. Olorin. The name comes from Unfinished Tales, the chapter titled The Istari, and it is not a minor detail buried in scholarly apparatus. It is the entire key to understanding what Gandalf is, where he came from, and why everything he does in Middle-earth means something different than it appears. Tolkien writes that among the Maiar of Valinor there was one who was called Olorin, and that he was numbered among the people of Manwë and Varda, the king and queen of Valinor, the highest of all the Valar. He dwelt in Lorien, not the golden forest of Galadriel. Lorien is the realm of Irmo, the Vala of dreams and visions, a place of rest and the healing of weariness, a realm built specifically for those who carry too much. Olorin lived there. That is not incidental. That tells you exactly what kind of being he was, before he ever became the Grey Wanderer with the pointed hat. The Valaquenta, the brief but essential document at the opening of the Silmarillion that catalogues the divine powers of Arda, lists Olorin among the Maiar and says something about him that should stop you cold. It says he was the wisest of the Maiar, not the most powerful, not the most feared, the wisest. And then it says he pitied the sorrows of the elves, not observed them, not catalogued them from a distance with divine detachment, pitied them, felt them, the way you feel someone else's grief when you have not yet learned to keep it at arm's length. Pay attention to that word, because it is the whole character, compressed into a single verb. His ministry in Valinor, long before the Third Age, long before the Istari were ever conceived as a mission, was to walk unseen among the elves and put away sorrow with wisdom and hope. He would come to them in their grief and their doubt, and he would not announce himself, not arrive in power, not compel them toward courage. He would simply be present, and in his presence something would shift, the heaviness would ease, the path forward would begin to look possible again. Picture this: the undying lands, before the world's first age has even properly begun. The trees of Valinor still giving their mingled light, an elf sitting alone in the gardens of Lorien, carrying the specific weight of some sorrow you cannot name, and a figure arriving so quietly they do not quite register as arriving at all. No proclamation, no display of power, just a presence, and then, eventually, hope, not given from above, kindled, the way you kindle a fire, not by creating warmth out of nothing, but by finding the spark that was always there, almost buried, and breathing on it until it catches. That was Olorin. That was what he was, at his core, in his deepest nature, before any of the rest of this story happened. And now hold that image, because everything that follows, from the Grey Havens to the slopes of Mount Doom, is that same figure, doing that same thing, at civilizational scale, over 3,000 years. But before the mission begins, there is a moment that Tolkien buries in unfinished tales and the peoples of Middle-earth that almost no one talks about. The moment when Olorin was asked to go to Middle-earth and said no. Not modestly, not as a formality that was immediately overruled. He said no because he was afraid. Tolkien is explicit about this. In the Istari chapter of Unfinished Tales, and corroborated in the discussions gathered in Peoples of Middle-earth, Tolkien writes that when the Valar resolved to send emissaries to Middle-earth to aid the free peoples against the growing shadow of Sauron, Olorin was among those considered, and that he declared himself too weak, too fearful, that he said he feared Sauron. Not diplomatically, not with false humility, with real, honest fear. The shadow was real to him. He knew what Sauron was. He had always known what Sauron was, from before the First Age, from before Sauron was Sauron and was still just Mehron, the gifted one, the one who chose Morgoth. Olorin had watched that happen. He knew exactly what the darkness could do. And Manwë, the king of Arda, heard that fear and sent him anyway. No, that is not quite right. Manwë heard that fear and sent him because of it. That is the thing nobody asks. Why did Manwë choose the one who expressed fear over the one who expressed ambition, or confidence, or a strategic plan? Tolkien gives the answer, quietly, and it is one of the most important sentences in the entire legendarium. He says that Manwë believed the one who pitied most was most fit to go. That compassion and the acknowledgement of one's own limitation were not disqualifications. They were the exact qualifications the mission required. Because here is what that actually means. The Istari were being sent not to conquer Sauron, not to match him in power and defeat him in a contest of will. They were being sent to inspire resistance in the free peoples, to counsel and encourage and kindle the latent capacity for courage in beings who were mortal and small and already living under a growing shadow. A being who believed himself invincible, who felt no fear, who was confident in his own power, was exactly the wrong being for that mission. That being would begin to dominate, to command, to substitute his own will for the wills of those he was supposed to serve. That being was, in fact, already named Saruman. Olorin's fear was his qualification. His acknowledgement that the task was too large for him was the precise reason he was chosen for it. The willingness to walk into the dark knowing you are afraid, that is not weakness. That is the only kind of courage that actually means anything. So he said yes. And then he did something extraordinary that Tolkien describes in a way that most readers pass over too quickly. He put on the body of an old man, not as a disguise, not as a convenient avatar he could step out of when things got serious. He put it on the way you put on a vow, as a commitment, as a limitation he was accepting as genuinely his own. This is where the cosmological stakes of Gandalf's story come into focus, and it requires understanding something about how Maiar embodiment actually works in Tolkien's world, because Tolkien thought about this with meticulous theological care. In Morgoth's Ring, one of the volumes in the History of Middle-earth series, in the essays Tolkien wrote under the heading Myths Transformed, he works through the mechanics of what happens when a Maya chooses to inhabit a physical form. He is clear that this is not a neutral or reversible process. The Maiar who take on flesh begin to be shaped by that flesh, not just in appearance, in appetite, in weariness, in perspective, in the gradual accumulation of physical experience that begins to feel like memory and eventually becomes inseparable from identity. A Maya in a body is not a spirit in a container. It is a spirit that has, to some genuine degree, become the body it chose, and in becoming it, has partially veiled itself from its own full nature. Think about what that means for Gandalf. He arrives in Middle-earth, at the Grey Havens, around the year 1000 of the Third Age. That is confirmed in the appendices of The Return of the King. He disembarks from a ship coming out of the west as an old man, already old, already carrying the appearance of mortality, already wearing the limitation. He has been in that body for, at this point, no time at all, and yet the body is already doing what bodies do. It is already beginning the process of making itself real. And then, here is the thing that almost breaks the heart of this entire story. He cannot fully remember, not clearly, not always. Tolkien's Myths Transformed makes plain that the partial veiling of awareness, the Astari accepted, was not a poetic metaphor. It was a real restriction, built into the terms of the mission itself. Olorin of the Maiar, one of the wisest beings in creation, who pitied the sorrows of elves before the sun was made, put on a body and accepted a partial eclipse of his own divine nature, including his awareness of that nature, because the mission required that he operate on a human scale, make genuinely human-scale decisions, and earn genuine trust from mortal creatures, rather than simply overwhelming them with the authority of what he was. There is a word for that in the Christian theology Tolkien was deeply shaped by: kenosis, self-emptying, the deliberate limiting of divine power and knowledge for the sake of genuine relationship with the mortal world. And now ask yourself a question the script will come back to, because it is the one that doesn't let go. If Gandalf could not fully remember what he was, if the veil of the incarnate body was real and the partial forgetting was genuine, then what exactly was he working with across those 2,000 years? What was he operating on, if not the full clarity of divine knowledge? He was operating on wisdom, on compassion, on a deep instinct for where the light was needed, and occasionally, very occasionally, on a glimpse through the veil. Círdan saw it immediately. Círdan the Shipwright, the oldest elf in Middle-earth at the time Gandalf arrived, the one who had stood on the shores of Beleriand in the First Age and watched Ulmo's waves roll in carrying the first news of the world, the elf who had built the ships that carried the host to Valinor and the ships that brought them back, the one whose foresight was quiet and sure, and had never yet been wrong. When Gandalf stepped off the ship at the Grey Havens, Círdan looked at him and understood something that would take the rest of the world 3,000 years to figure out. He gave Gandalf Narya, the Ring of Fire, one of the 3 elven rings, the ones that Sauron had never touched, the ones that were not subject to his dominion, the ones that held within them a genuine strain of the world's original creative fire. Círdan had received Narya directly from Gil-galad, and he was under no obligation, no instruction, to pass it on. He kept it for himself, through the entirety of the Second Age. And then Gandalf walked off that ship, and Círdan handed it over. He gives a reason. Tolkien records it in Unfinished Tales. Círdan says, "Take now this ring, for thy labors and thy sorrows are heavy, but it will support thee, and from weariness it shall rekindle thee, for the fire is against the enemy." And then he says something that carries extraordinary weight when you understand who Círdan is. He says that, in Gandalf's hands, Narya will be better used than in his own. Because of those coming to the shores of Middle-earth, Gandalf's need would be the greatest. The oldest, most perceptive elf in the world looked at the most recently arrived Istar and said, You are the one this belongs to. Your task is the hardest. And then Tolkien adds that Círdan kept this a secret, even from Saruman and Radagast, the other Istari. Gandalf wore Narya hidden. For the better part of 3,000 years, the greatest source of active creative power in Middle-earth was carried in secret by a wandering old man who spent a significant portion of his time in a small agricultural region full of people who preferred not to be bothered. Now hold that alongside the rest of what Gandalf was doing during those years, because the appendices confirm that between his arrival around year 1000 of the Third Age and the events of The Hobbit in 2941, nearly 2,000 years pass, and Tolkien is not silent about what Gandalf was doing in them. He was everywhere. He was in constant motion. He was attending councils, tracking rumors, visiting the Dunedain, watching the borders, gathering intelligence. He was at the White Council, arguing that the necromancer of Dol Guldur should be driven out rather than left to fester, and losing that argument to Saruman, who had his own reasons for wanting the hunt for the One Ring delayed. He was watching Sauron's return before most of the world knew what was returning. He was doing, in other words, precisely what Manwë had sent him to do, not commanding armies, not dominating councils, but thinking, observing, connecting the threads of a pattern that no one else was looking at all at once. And then he met a hobbit. The meeting with Bilbo Baggins in 2941 is the most famous moment in Tolkien's legendarium before the War of the Ring itself. And it is routinely misread as a charming coincidence, a fortuitous collision between a wandering wizard and an unlikely hero. It was not that, not even slightly. Tolkien is careful about this. In Unfinished Tales, in the discussion of the mission of the Istari, and in the surrounding context of the White Council material, the picture that emerges is of Gandalf moving with deliberate, long-considered purpose. He was not passing through the Shire on a pleasant morning when he happened to remember Bilbo and thought an adventure might do him good. He had been watching the Shire for some time. He had been thinking about the dragon Smaug and the Lonely Mountain, and what Smaug's continued existence meant for the strategic landscape of the north, which would be a flank exposed to Sauron's influence if Sauron continued his return to full power. He had thought about what kind of person you would need for a mission that required not strength or military prowess, but exactly the particular combination of qualities a well-regarded hobbit of good family might possess, such as the ability to move quietly, to be overlooked, to be underestimated by creatures whose sense of threat is calibrated for larger, more obviously dangerous opponents. He chose Bilbo Baggins with the calculated precision of a spy master who had spent 2,000 years learning to read people. But here is what that calculation could not have included, because Tolkien is specific about this in Letter 107. When Gandalf encountered the ring in Bilbo's possession, when he began to suspect what it might be, he did not know with certainty. Not for decades, not until the night he finally tested the ring in Frodo's fireplace, and watched the letters of fire emerge from the gold, confirming what he had feared and suspected, and, perhaps, at some deep level already known for years. He allowed Bilbo to carry it for 60 years on suspicion. Picture this. 60 years of watching, of visiting the Shire more than anyone thought necessary, watching a hobbit age in the strange way Bilbo aged, too slowly, with that edge of something wrong underneath the ease of him, the way he talked about the ring with just a shade too much possessiveness. 60 years of turning the question over. Not because Gandalf was slow, not because he lacked the intelligence to work it out sooner, but because certainty was not available, and the alternative to patience was to act on suspicion and potentially destroy the one thing in the world that might, if handled with extraordinary care, be used to unmake Sauron entirely. He was not being cautious for caution's sake. He was being careful because the stakes were cosmological, and he knew it, and he had to carry that knowledge through 60 years of birthday parties and pipe smoke while wearing the face of an old man who made fireworks for children. The loneliness of that is almost impossible to hold. Now here is where it gets strange, because the conversation in Chapter 2 of The Fellowship of the Ring, the chapter Tolkien called The Shadow of the Past, is not just Gandalf briefing Frodo. It is Gandalf confessing, and most people who have read it several times have never quite registered it as that. Gandalf tells Frodo the full history of the ring. He explains the forging, the war, the loss, the finding, the slow corruption. He explains why the ring cannot be hidden, why it cannot be destroyed by ordinary means, why it cannot be given to anyone powerful because the most powerful would be the most destroyed by it. He explains all of this with clarity and authority, and then, almost buried inside the explanation, he says something that reframes the entire context of everything he has just described. He admits he suspected the ring was the one for years before he confirmed it. He says it plainly, without softening. He knew Bilbo had it. He watched what it was doing to Bilbo. He arranged, at the party, to ensure Bilbo left it behind. And then he tells Frodo that he was not certain, that he had to wait, that he had to hope. He allowed 60 years to pass with the one ring in a hobbit hole, because the alternative to hope was either inaction or a kind of intervention he was specifically prohibited from taking. And when he finally confirmed his suspicion, he did not immediately take control of the situation. He gave Frodo the ring and told him it was his burden to carry. Not Gandalf's, not the Council's, not the Valar, Frodo's. And this is the exact center of the entire theological project that Tolkien was building, because the prohibition on domination that the Istari carried was not a strategic restriction, it was a moral one. It was the Valar's answer to the disaster of Númenor, to the lesson they had learned when the Valar sent an army to Arda to deal with Morgoth, and in doing so, created conditions for exactly the kind of pride and resentment and desire to escape death that eventually unmade the Númenorians entirely. Enforced salvation is no salvation. The free peoples of Middle-earth had to choose. They had to choose, freely, or the choice meant nothing, and if the choice meant nothing, then the victory over Sauron would be hollow, and the next shadow would find them even less capable of resisting, because they would have learned nothing about their own capacity to stand. Gandalf understood this, completely. He understood it better than any other Istar, which is part of why he was the one who stayed faithful to the mission while the others wandered or fell. Saruman understood the prohibition too, of course. He simply disagreed with it. The fall of Saruman is one of the most important lenses for understanding Gandalf's faithfulness, because they were sent for the same purpose, given the same restrictions, and given access to the same pool of potential influence, and they made opposite choices. Tolkien is careful, in Unfinished Tales, to trace the precise shape of Saruman's corruption. It did not begin with his decision to use his voice to dominate others. It began with his pride, with his belief that he understood power better than the Valar who had sent him, with his growing conviction that the prohibition was not wisdom, but weakness, that a stronger hand could do what patience could not. He began studying the rings of power not to understand them, but to possess their secret. He delayed the White Council from acting against Dol Guldur, because he privately hoped to find the one ring before anyone else could use it. And he believed his will was strong enough to wield it against Sauron and win. He was wrong, of course, but the specific nature of his wrongness is worth understanding, because it is the mirror image of Gandalf's rightness. Saruman believed that the power to dominate was the only power that mattered. He believed that if you could not command, you could not lead, and if you could not lead, you were simply one more piece on the board, being moved by someone else. His entire philosophical structure was built on the premise that what the Valar called restraint was actually just fear, dressed up as ethics. And so he used his voice to bend the wills of those around him. He used his knowledge to hoard strategic advantage. He became, gradually, exactly what Tolkien describes in the Silmarillion as the fundamental error of Morgoth and Sauron. He began to pour himself into his desire for power over others, and in doing so, he diminished. Not all at once, but consistently, over decades, until the voice was there and the wisdom was gone, until the tower was beautiful and the man inside it was hollow. Gandalf never did that, and the reason he never did that is not simply moral strength, though it was that too. It is that Gandalf was, at his core, the being who had spent his pre-incarnate existence putting away sorrow by kindling hope, and he could no more stop doing that than fire can stop giving light. Picture this, the long years of the Third Age, countless councils, countless conversations with rangers in the wild, and elves in fading halls, and men in courts that are slowly forgetting why their kingdoms were built. Gandalf moving through all of it, this figure in grey with his pipe and his staff, and his eyes that are, if you look directly into them, a very long way down, not commanding, not pronouncing, asking, listening, finding the person in the room who is about to give up and talking to them until they remember why they should not. He does this for 2,000 years, and nobody is keeping count. Nobody is recording most of it. The appendices give us a skeleton of events, the White Council meetings, the major movements, the key interventions. But the texture of what Gandalf actually did across those 2 millennia, the daily work of it, the 100 small conversations for every large one, the choosing to be present rather than powerful, the choosing to trust rather than command, that is mostly invisible in the record. And the invisibility is part of the point. Tolkien is deeply interested in the labor that goes unacknowledged, because it is too fine-grained to be seen clearly from above, and Gandalf's 2,000-year ministry of hope is perhaps the most sustained example of that in the entire legendarium. He is doing what Olorin always did. He has simply brought the practice to a world that needs it more urgently than the Gardens of Valinor ever did. But the veil over his divine nature means he does not always know he is doing it. And that is where the story begins to ache. We need to sit with the mechanics of that veil, because they matter enormously to everything that follows. And the temptation is to rush past them toward the more dramatic events when the events are actually incomprehensible without them. Tolkien's Myths Transformed, Essays in Morgoth's Ring, are not widely read, and there is a reason this material tends to stay in footnotes and scholarly discussions. It is difficult, dense, and theologically precise in ways that require knowing what Tolkien believed about spirit and matter and the relationship between them. But the central point is accessible, and it is this. When a Maya inhabits a body, the body is not a shell. It is a genuine transformation. The spirit does not sit inside the flesh, the way a driver sits inside a car. The spirit becomes, in some real sense, what it inhabits. The appetites of the body become genuinely the Maya's appetites. The weariness of the body becomes genuinely the Maya's weariness. The fears of the body, the physical fear of pain, of death, of the unknown darkness, those become genuinely the Maya's fears. This is why Tolkien calls the Maiar, in embodied form, incarnate, a word that in Christian theology carries the specific weight of spirit made genuinely, completely, irreversibly flesh. For Gandalf, this means that the old man's body is not a disguise. It is, to a significant degree, who he is in the Third Age. His love of pipeweed, his affection for the Shire, his genuine delight in fireworks, his irritability when his plans are ignored, his very real physical exhaustion on the long road from the Shire to Rivendell, none of these are performance. They are the natural texture of an incarnate Maya who has been in his body long enough that the body's pleasures and discomforts are genuinely his. And this is what makes his courage at moments of extremity so astonishing. Because when Gandalf faces the Balrog on the bridge of Khazad-dûm, he is not doing it as a being who is comfortably certain of his own divine invincibility. He is doing it as a being who is genuinely, in some significant proportion, old, genuinely tired, genuinely aware of how dark that darkness is, aware of it the way the body is aware of darkness, which is the most primal awareness there is. He does it anyway. He does it with the words of jurisdiction, with the staff and the sword, and the authority of someone who has, for this single required moment, reached through the veil and pulled back enough of what he truly is, to say with complete honesty, "I am a servant of the secret fire, wielder of the flame of Anor. You cannot pass." And then the bridge breaks, and he falls, and he fights the Balrog through the depths of the world, through water and fire and the roots of the mountain, and he dies. Not theatrically, not as a narrative gesture. He dies. Tolkien is clear about this. In letter 156, Tolkien writes that Gandalf passed away, and that his Maya spirit was sent back by the Valar. The return as Gandalf the White is not a revival, it is a second sending. A new commission, the same spirit in a restored body, with an expanded mandate, freed from some of the original restrictions that governed his first mission, now carrying the white of authority rather than the gray of patient service. But between the fall and the return, something happens that Tolkien only gestures at, and the gesture is worth everything. He lay in Lothlorien. That is the detail. After the death and the return, after the long fight in the water and the fire, and the final victory over the Balrog on the peak of Ziraxigil, before he is clothed again in white and sent back to the world, Gandalf lies in Lothlorien, in the realm of the Lady Galadriel, in the realm that is itself a reflection of Lorien, the original realm of Irmo in Valinor, where Olorin first learned his ministry of consolation. He rests in the place that is most like home. Think about what that means. At the end of his life as Gandalf the Grey, at the precise moment of his death, he is brought to the one place in Middle-earth that most nearly resembles the garden where he walked before he had a name that mortals could speak. The place he has been carrying in his nature across 3,000 years, not as a memory exactly, but as an ache, the way you carry the memory of a smell from childhood, present always just below the level of conscious thought. And now ask yourself the question again, but heavier this time, carrying everything you now know. If the veil over his divine nature was real, if the partial forgetting was genuine, if 2,000 years of incarnation had shaped and limited his awareness of what he truly was, then what did it feel like, lying in that garden, at the end of the Grey mission, to be somewhere that called back, however faintly, to what he had been before? Was it recognition? Was it grief? Was it both at once? Tolkien does not tell us. He rarely tells us the things that matter most. He shows us the shape of them and trusts us to feel the weight. Now we need to turn toward the specific work of the Third Age, toward the precise strategy of what Gandalf was actually building across all those centuries, because the pattern only becomes visible once you step back far enough to see the whole shape of it, and the shape is remarkable. Gandalf's consistent strategic focus, across his entire career, was on the small and the overlooked. Not exclusively, he worked with kings and councils and the great powers of the age, but his deepest investments were never there. His deepest investments were in the Shire, in the Dunedain, in the overleak heirs of forgotten kingdoms, in the unexpected and the underestimated. He watched the line of Isildur with extraordinary care. He knew Aragorn. He found Aragorn as a child and arranged for him to be fostered in Rivendell under the protection of Elrond, who knew more about the line of Isildur than any living being. He revealed Aragorn's heritage to him when Aragorn was 20 years old. He guided his long preparation across decades. Tolkien's appendices make the timeline clear. Gandalf was investing in Aragorn for most of Aragorn's life, a partnership that was less dramatic than the more visible council debates, but arguably more essential to the final outcome than almost anything else Gandalf did. Because the return of the king was not going to happen by accident. It was going to happen because someone spent decades ensuring that the last heir of Isildur was trained, was ready, knew what he was, and chose to claim it. That someone was Gandalf. And simultaneously, he was watching the Shire. The Shire is the most constant mystery in Tolkien's arrangement of the story, the thing that requires the most suspension of analytical instinct from readers who want to draw clean lines between importance and smallness. Why does the fate of the world pass through a farming community of people who have bred their most significant ambitions down to the quality of their vegetable gardens and the frequency of their meals? Why does the One Ring end up carried to Mordor by a being so far outside any reasonable strategic calculation that Sauron simply cannot model it? Because Gandalf put it there. Not the ring, he did not choose where the ring ended up, but the tradition. The orientation toward courage, dressed as ordinariness, the particular quality of hobbit endurance that does not look like heroism from the outside and is, on the inside, the most stubborn form of heroism there is. Tolkien did not invent hobbits as a narrative convenience. He invented them as a theological statement. They are the embodiment of the eucatastrophe principle, the turn at the edge of the abyss that nobody saw coming because it was too small to be a threat. Gandalf understood this. He cultivated it. He visited the Shire, generation after generation, not for pipe smoke and good meals, though those were genuine pleasures, but because the Shire was the place where the thing Sauron could not understand was most concentrated. Sauron could model power. He could model greed, ambition, pride, fear. He could not model the willingness to carry a burden without any expectation of glory, simply because it needed to be carried. That quality needed tending. It needed the occasional introduction of the outside world. It needed a wizard who showed up every few decades with fireworks and stories about distant mountains, kept the local culture from becoming entirely closed to the possibility of elsewhere, and chose one particular family whose took blood ran warm enough that the outside world was, for them, a temptation rather than a threat. And then he waited. Picture this: Gandalf, somewhere in the long middle of the Third Age, not at a council, not in a throne room, sitting on a hillside outside a hobbit hole in the late afternoon light, smoking his pipe, watching the sun go down over the Shire, watching children run through the long grass. And carrying, because he is always carrying it, the knowledge of what is coming, the knowledge that the shadow to the east is not finished, that the peace of this valley is borrowed against a debt that will one day be called in, and choosing, again, for the 10,000th time, not to say it, not to warn them, not to burden them with what they cannot yet carry, to just sit here and smoke and let the light last as long as it will. This is the hardest thing a guardian can do. The hardest. Not the combat. Not the councils. Not even the death. The choosing to let the ones you love remain innocent a little longer, knowing that innocence is itself the weapon, and the weapon will only function if it is not told it is a weapon. We have talked about what the mission was. We have talked about how Gandalf's nature made him precisely suited for it. Now we need to talk about the thing the mission required of him that no summary of the plot ever fully captures. It required him to be, for most of his career, misunderstood, not as a tactical position, not as a deliberate strategy of concealment, though there was that too, as a permanent condition of existence. The people who needed him most were the people who understood him least. The great elves, Galadriel, Elrond, Círdan, they knew what he was. They treated him with the reverence appropriate to a Maya. But the men of Gondor and Rohan, the dwarves of the mountain kingdoms, the hobbits of the Shire, to them he was a wizard, a useful curiosity, a dangerous old man with unreliable punctuality and strong opinions about what you ought to do next. They trusted his judgment, sometimes, when they could bring themselves to. They followed his advice, occasionally, when it aligned with what they already wanted to do, but they did not know what they were trusting. They did not know what they were following. And he could not tell them. Not because it was secret, but because the knowledge would have changed the relationship in exactly the wrong direction. If the men of Rohan knew they were being guided by a Maya of the same order as Sauron himself, they would not have been inspired to courage. They would have been inspired to dependency. They would have sat down and waited for the divine beings to sort it out. The entire point would have collapsed. So he wore the grey cloak and the pointed hat, and the expression of a slightly exasperated teacher whose students keep making the same avoidable mistakes, and he watched, for 2,000 years, as the world he was trying to save mostly failed to notice him doing it. The White Council is the most sustained example of this dynamic in the lore outside of the War of the Ring itself. Tolkien gives us the Council's history across several documents, primarily unfinished tales. And what emerges is a picture of Gandalf operating within a political structure that consistently undervalued what he was actually doing and overvalued what Saruman was doing. The Council was ostensibly a body of the wise, elves and Istari deliberating together on the best response to the returning shadow. In practice, it was a body chaired by Saruman, whose intelligence Gandalf respected, and whose judgment he was increasingly, across the centuries, coming to distrust. The specific disagreement about Dol Guldur is essential to understanding how the War of the Ring almost went differently in a direction that would have been catastrophic. Gandalf wanted to drive the necromancer from Dol Guldur earlier. Significantly earlier, the White Council finally acts against Dol Guldur in the year 2941, the same year as the events of The Hobbit, but Gandalf had been pressing for this action for decades, and he had been blocked by Saruman each time. Tolkien tells us in Unfinished Tales that Saruman had his reasons, primarily the secret hope of finding the One Ring before anyone else, and he used his position and authority within the council to delay. And Gandalf lost that argument, repeatedly, for years. This is a Gandalf that the films don't quite show, and perhaps cannot show, because the politics of it are slow and undramatic. It is Gandalf being overruled by a colleague he increasingly suspects is corrupted, being unable to prove it, being forced to work around the edges, finding other avenues for the same essential purpose. It is the consummate intelligence analyst who has correctly identified the threat and cannot get the institution to act on the analysis, choosing not to abandon the institution but to operate within it more creatively. The Hobbit, the seemingly unrelated adventure of a dwarf company and their burglar, is one of those creative operations. Tolkien is explicit in Unfinished Tales that Gandalf's involvement with Thorin Oakenshield and the quest to reclaim Erebor was not incidental to his larger strategy. He arranged it. He met Thorin, he says in Unfinished Tales, in Bree, the year before the quest, when Thorin was brooding on revenge and the recovery of the Arkenstone. And Gandalf thought, there is something useful here, not only for the dwarves, not only for the Shire, which would be dangerously exposed if Sauron had an ally in Smaug, but for the entire strategic picture of the North. He needed Smaug gone. He needed Erebor restored, not for sentimental reasons, not because he had a particular attachment to the dwarves, but because a restored kingdom under the Lonely Mountain was a significant strategic asset against the movements of Sauron's power in the east. And he needed it done in a way that did not involve the Istari using their power to simply remove a dragon, because that would have been exactly the kind of direct divine intervention the mission prohibited. So he found a burglar. He found a burglar with Took blood, and a hobbit's gift for being overlooked, sent him into a mountain with a company of dwarves, and trusted the outcome to the same combination of preparation and grace and individual courage that he always trusted, because that was the only combination available to him. And it worked, not cleanly, not without tragedy. Thorin died under the mountain's shadow. Fili and Kili died. The Battle of Five Armies was messy and brutal, and not remotely what anyone had planned. But Smaug was dead. Erebor was restored. And Bilbo Baggins came home with a ring he'd found in a cave under a mountain that turned out to be, give or take, 60 years of careful watching, the fulcrum of the entire age. Now here is the lore layer most people miss about the discovery of the ring. When Gandalf finally tests the ring in Frodo's fireplace, and the letters of fire appear in the gold, confirming what he has feared across 60 years of watching and hoping and dreading. He is not surprised. Or rather, he is surprised only in the way that you are surprised when a thing you already knew becomes undeniable. The shock is not informational. It is the shock of certainty, arriving where before you had only weight and probability, and the quiet daily horror of carrying a suspicion you cannot yet act on. The chapter that follows, The Shadow of the Past, is the most compressed and most important lore delivery in the entire novel. And it is delivered by Tolkien through Gandalf's voice, for a reason that goes beyond narrative convenience. Gandalf knows this history in a way that Elrond's council does not fully know it, in a way that no living being fully knows it, because Gandalf has been watching the shadow of it moving across the Third Age for 2,000 years, gathering the threads, understanding not just what happened but why, what the ring is not just functionally but theologically, what it means that it chose to surface again now, in this village, with this family. He knows what Frodo does not yet know, what the reader does not yet know, that the ring is already working on Frodo, that the generosity Bilbo found in that cave under the mountain and the courage Frodo will need to carry the gift to the fire are not separate things. That the ring will test exactly the quality of will that hobbits are best at, the ability to refuse, and that this refusal, this small, local, utterly individual choice, is the thing the entire age of the world has been moving toward. Everything Gandalf has done, every conversation, every counsel, every strategic arrangement, every carefully placed seed of courage in every overlooked corner of the world, has been building toward the moment when Frodo Baggins says yes. Not yes to power, not yes to glory, yes to the burden. The Fellowship of the Ring, the formal gathering at Rivendell, is the moment when Gandalf's 2,000 years of patient groundwork becomes briefly, visibly, architecturally real. Because what assembles at Rivendell is not an army. It is a cross-section of exactly the right people, each of whom Gandalf has, directly or indirectly, prepared. Aragorn, trained and positioned across decades. Legolas and Gimli, representatives of peoples whose ancient enmity is one of the Third Age's most persistent vulnerabilities, now asked to walk the same road. Boromir, whose presence is complicated, and whose fate is tragic, and whose inclusion by Elrond makes a certain kind of strategic sense that Gandalf is well aware of, even as he understands what it might cost. And at the center, Frodo, with the ring, carrying what none of the powerful can carry. And Gandalf, walking at the edge of all of it, the architect who does not introduce himself as the architect. The departure from Rivendell, the crossing of Caradhras, the choice at the gates of Moria. These are moments the films render visually and dramatically in ways that are hard to improve on, but the lore underneath them is something the films never quite access. The choice of Moria is not a failure of planning. It is a deliberate risk taken by a being who knows, better than anyone, what is beneath that mountain, who knows about the Balrog, who has known about the Balrog, and who leads the company in anyway, because the alternative route is worse, and because Gandalf understands that there are moments when the path to safety runs directly through the thing you most fear. He does not tell the Fellowship about the Balrog before they enter. Think about that. He knows, and he leads them in. This is not deception. It is the precise judgment of a guide who understands that the knowledge of what waits in the deep would be paralyzing rather than useful, that the company's courage will serve them better if it is uncontracted by anticipatory terror, and that the only thing that changes what happens in Moria is what happens in Moria, not what the Fellowship thinks about on the road to Moria. He is making the calculation that the one who trained him made. He is trusting, as Manwë trusted him, that the fear is real and the task is right, and the only way forward is through. And then the bridge. Here is what that moment actually is. When Gandalf stands on the bridge of Khazad-dûm and faces the Balrog, he is not making a tactical decision. He is not buying time for the Fellowship to escape while he fights a holding action. He is doing both of those things, yes, but he is also doing something older and more essential. He is facing, in embodied form, the thing he has feared since before the world was shaped. The Balrogs were Maiar of the Order of Morgoth. They were, once, creatures of the same kind as Olorin. They chose differently. They chose Morgoth and the fire of destruction over Manwë and the fire of creation. But they were his kin, not metaphorically, literally, the same order of being. He is facing what he chose not to become. The words he speaks on the bridge are not a spell. They are a declaration of identity. I am a servant of the secret fire, wielder of the flame of Anor. The dark fire will not avail you. Flame of Udun. Go back to the shadow. He is saying, I know what you are. I know what I am. And these two things cannot occupy the same space on this bridge, in this moment, in this world that is trying to choose between them. You shall not pass. And the Balrog does not pass. Not because the bridge holds. The bridge does not hold, but because Gandalf holds, until the bridge breaks, and then he holds still, falling, fighting in the depths, winning in the end and dying in the winning, because that is what the mission required, and he knew it when he agreed to come, even when he was afraid to agree. And now the second return. Because this is where the central question of the whole script becomes most painful. Tolkien describes the return as Gandalf the White in several places, most usefully in the appendices and in letter 156. The new commission is real. The expanded mandate is real. Gandalf the White is not simply Gandalf the Grey with a change of wardrobe. Something is different. He has, in some measure, more authority, more access to what he is. The veil is thinner, and he demonstrates this in encounters that the Grey Gandalf could not have managed. His confrontation with Theoden, the breaking of Saruman at Isengard, the holding of the gates of Minas Tirith against the Witch King. But pay attention to this next part, because it is quietly devastating. He is still here. He has survived death and been sent back by the Valar, been given a white robe and an escalated mission, and he is still here, doing what he was always doing. Not ruling, not commanding armies with divine authority and finishing the war in a season. Not doing what the power of his true nature could presumably accomplish in any number of ways that would make the rest of the story much shorter. He is still here, riding from Rohan to Gondor to Minas Tirith, still counseling and persuading and inspiring, still working through the free choices of mortal beings rather than around them, still carrying the most important restriction the Valar ever imposed on an emissary. The new commission did not remove the fundamental limit. It extended his stamina and authority within that limit. He cannot force the outcome. And the question that hangs over the final third of the story is this: does he know how it ends? Can he see it? Has the return, the death, and the second commission given him back enough of his divine awareness to look at the board and read the pattern? Or is he still, even now, acting on wisdom and hope and the long, patient faith of someone who has learned to trust the quality he has spent 2,000 years carefully tending in the world? The text is ambiguous on this, deliberately, I think, because the question of whether Gandalf can see the end is the question of whether his courage is divine certainty or mortal faith, and the answer changes everything about what his presence in the story means. Here is what the lore offers, and it is not quite a resolution. In letter 156, Tolkien says that Gandalf returned with greater insight, not with foreknowledge, not with certainty, with insight, which is a different word, doing different work. Insight is the ability to see clearly into what is, to understand deeply the nature of the forces at play, to read the pattern of probability more accurately than less wise beings can. It is not prophecy. It is not certainty. It is wisdom operating at its highest possible temperature. So perhaps the answer is, he can see more clearly than he could before. He can see that the pattern is building towards something, that the pieces are in place for a turn that no amount of Sauron's power can prevent if the right choices are made by the right people. He can see the eucatastrophe as a real structural possibility, rather than merely a hope. But he cannot guarantee it, and he knows he cannot guarantee it. And so he continues to do the only thing available to him. He makes the choices possible, again and again. He rides to Theoden and speaks the words that break Saruman's influence over Rohan, because Rohan's cavalry will be essential at Pelennor, and Pelennor is one of the hinges the age turns on. He goes to Minas Tirith, not to command, but to hold, to be the reason the walls of the city do not break psychologically before the physical breach, to be the white figure on the parapets that the defenders can look at when they are about to stop believing they can hold. He holds Faramir under care and watches the pyre and stops it, not with irresistible divine authority, but with a horse and a torch, and the willingness to act in the one thin window of time where acting is still possible. He is not wielding the power of a Maya at Minas Tirith. He is wielding the judgment of a being who has spent 3,000 years learning exactly where to stand, so that his presence shifts the outcome without replacing the choice. This is the craft of it. This is the thing nobody can quite teach, because it requires not just wisdom but the humility to know your own limits and work precisely at the edge of them, rather than pretending they don't exist, or chafing against them until you break, the way Saruman broke. And then the eagles come. This moment has generated more commentary, more argument, more "why didn't they just use the eagles" confusion than almost any other scene in the entirety of Tolkien's work. And the confusion is almost entirely a product of the films, which present the eagles as a transport option Gandalf had access to the whole time and simply never chose. The lore is very different, and understanding the difference reframes the entire final movement of the War of the Ring. The eagles are not a resource. They are not a tool. They are, in Tolkien's cosmological framework, agents of Manwë, the king of Valinor, the highest of the Valar. When they intervene at the Morannon, when they arrive over the fiery slopes of Mount Doom at the moment of Frodo's desperation and Gollum's accidental grace, they are not executing a plan that Gandalf arranged in advance. They are the visible edge of a providence that Manwë has been watching, that the Valar have been watching, waiting for the moment when the free choices of free peoples have reached a juncture where support from above is not coercion, but completion. Tolkien calls this eucatastrophe. The word appears in his essay On Fairy Stories, and the definition he gives is precise. Eucatastrophe is the good catastrophe, the sudden joyous turn in the story that was not inevitable, that could not have been planned for, but that feels, when it arrives, not like luck, but like grace. Not like the world bending to accommodate a wish, but like the world revealing, at last, the deep structure of what it has always been. The eagles arrive because Frodo chose to carry the burden, because Samwise chose not to abandon him, because Gollum, broken and obsessed and finally mad with desire for the thing that destroyed him, slipped at the exact moment and in the exact way that destroyed the ring and himself simultaneously, because no plan could have predicted that configuration of choices. Because Gandalf, who had been seeding this possibility for 2,000 years, could not guarantee it, but could make it possible, and making it possible was the whole of his mission. Letter 181 contains the sentence that brings this into full clarity. Tolkien writes that the eagles, the intervention at the critical moment, are the working of a eucatastrophic providence, that Gandalf is an angelic being, operating under divine mandate, and that the entire resolution of the War of the Ring is simultaneously the result of the free choices of mortal beings, and the completion of a divine purpose that has been operating through those choices all along. Not overriding them, not predetermining them, operating through them, the way the secret fire that Gandalf serves operates through the flame that individual beings kindle, rather than replacing it with its own. He is not a wizard. He was never a wizard. He is a servant of the secret fire, who spent 3,000 years teaching people to burn. Now we need to talk about Sauron, We need to talk about Sauron because the entire context of Gandalf's mission only becomes fully visible when you hold it against what Sauron was doing during the same period, and the contrast is almost unbearably instructive. Sauron was a Maya too. He was, in the order of Aule the Smith, the greatest craftsman among the Maiar before he chose Morgoth. He was not stupid. He was not crude. He was, in fact, one of the most gifted and sophisticated minds in the history of Arda. He forged the One Ring in the Second Age, and nearly conquered the entire world with it. And when that failed, when the last alliance broke his physical form, and the ring was taken from him, he spent the entirety of the Third Age rebuilding, patiently, intelligently, waiting for the moment when he could act again. And his strategy for that rebuilding was based on the one thing he understood perfectly, and that he could not imagine anyone genuinely choosing not to use: power. He gathered power. He hoarded it, cultivated it, extended it, understood the mechanisms by which it could be multiplied and concentrated. He looked at the free peoples of Middle-earth, and he saw the same thing they saw in him: the willingness to dominate, the desire to control, the fundamental Morgothian error of believing that you can possess the world rather than loving it. He could not imagine Gandalf. Not really. He could imagine a servant of the Valar who was constrained from using full power, who was forced to operate at reduced capacity, who was therefore weaker than he appeared to be. He understood the prohibition as a limitation, as a strategic handicap that the Istari labored under, as a weakness to be exploited. What he could not imagine was that the prohibition was not a handicap, but a methodology, that the restriction on domination was not something Gandalf worked around, but something Gandalf had internalized so completely that it was simply the shape of how he thought about everything. Sauron could model a Gandalf who was frustrated by his limitations. He could not model a Gandalf who had chosen those limitations from the inside, who had accepted the body and the veil and the 2,000 years of slow, patient work, not because he was forced to, but because he understood, at the level of his deepest nature, that this was the only way to do what needed doing. And this is why Sauron, for all his intelligence and foresight and the genuine terror of his power, was always going to lose. Not because he was weaker than the Valar in a straight contest of strength. He wasn't, necessarily. The straightest contest of strength was one the free peoples could not win. He was going to lose because his entire model of the world was wrong. He believed that power was the currency of existence, that the question every being was always answering was, how much power do I have, and how do I get more of it? And that any apparent deviation from this was either deception or weakness. He could not process the information that a being capable of immense power was choosing, freely and from genuine conviction, to operate with restraint. It did not compute. The data that suggested it was enemy deception was always going to win over the data that suggested it was real, because the real version was impossible in his cosmological framework. He could not see Frodo coming. He could not see what the Shire was. He could not see what the patience and love and 2,000-year ministry of a grey wanderer in a pointed hat had been building, right in front of him, in the smallest and most overlooked corner of the world. He never even bothered to look. Picture this, the Dark Tower, in the long middle of the Third Age. Sauron in Barad-dûr, his eye moving across the landscape of Middle-earth, tracking the movements of armies and alliances, cataloguing the relative strengths of Gondor and Rohan and the Dwarven kingdoms, calculating the timeline of his own rebuilding, monitoring the Istari as potential threats, as constraints to be understood and eventually circumvented. His attention moving west and north, passing over the Green Hill country and the Shire, with the automatic disinterest of an intelligence that has correctly assessed this region as containing nothing of military or magical significance, not blindness. Assessment, correct on every metric that matters to him. And in a garden in Hobbiton, a small person with large feet is being shown fireworks by a figure in grey and told stories about the outside world, and the long, slow process of becoming the bearer of what Sauron most desires and most fears is beginning in a way that will not announce itself to him until it is finished. This is the whole story. Power looking away from love because it cannot recognize love as a threat, and love quietly, patiently, steadily doing the only thing it knows how to do, kindling the fire. We need to now talk about what Gandalf knew about himself, and when he knew it, and whether the answer to that question changes the weight of everything he did. Because this is the part that haunts me most, the part that I think is the true hidden heart of the complete story, the part that the casual reading of the books, the films, even most lore discussions, consistently slides past. Tolkien's Myths Transforms essays and the related materials in Morgoth's Ring establish that the Maiar in incarnate form could retain, with effort, awareness of their true nature, but that this awareness was not constant, not reliable, not an always available resource they could draw on at will. It was more like a buried knowledge, something real and present underneath the surface of the embodied experience, accessible in moments of extremity or clarity, less accessible in the ordinary days, less accessible, in other words, in the Shire, in the long, slow decades of pipe smoke and birthday parties and the comfortable rhythms of agricultural life. What this means for Gandalf is that his awareness of being Olorin, his memory of Valinor and the gardens of Lorien and the face of Manwë and the weight of his original nature fluctuated. There were probably moments when it was very close to the surface, the confrontation at the bridge, the death and the return. Lying in Lothlorien in the garden that was most like home. There were probably many more moments when it was almost completely obscured, when the old man in the grey robe was what he felt himself to be, not a divine being wearing a body, but a body that had once, long ago, something larger in it than most bodies hold. And here is the devastation of that. Every act of courage Gandalf performed in the moments when the veil was most complete, when he was most entirely the old man rather than the Maya. Those acts are different in kind from what they would have been if he had always been fully aware. When he held the line in the dark of Moria with something like faith, with something like hope, drawing on reserves of resolve that he could feel but could not clearly identify, not knowing with certainty whether they would be enough, that is a form of courage that a purely divine being, operating from full clarity of identity and purpose, could never have achieved. Because that courage is mortal courage. It is the specific bravery of a being who is not certain, who cannot see the end, who is afraid and goes anyway. And what the mission required, what the world required, was not the intervention of a being who was certain of victory. It was the witness of a being who walked into the dark the same way the mortals he was guiding walked into it, with hope, with wisdom, without certainty. He did not know he would survive Moria. He could not know. Not because he lacked the divine nature to survive it, but because the body he wore was genuinely capable of death, and the veil made him genuinely capable of fear, and the combination of those two genuine things meant that his choice to stand on the bridge was a real choice, made under real constraint, with real stakes. It was not theater. It was not a divine being performing vulnerability for an appreciative audience. It was, as nearly as a Maya can come to it without abandoning his nature entirely, an act of faith. And Tolkien, who believed in faith the way he believed in language and story, and the secret fire that runs underneath all of it, knew exactly what he was building here. He was building the argument that the grandest heroism in the world is the heroism of the being who gives everything they have, including the certainty of having it, for the sake of something that cannot be guaranteed. He was building the argument that what Manwë saw in Olorin's fear, what made Olorin the right choice above all others, was precisely this capacity. The capacity to not know and act anyway, to not see clearly and trust anyway, to carry the weight of the world not like a god who was always going to win, but like a servant who could not be certain, and chose to show up regardless. This is the thing the films cannot quite capture, not through any failure of craft, but because the nature of visual storytelling compresses time and clarifies identity in ways that erase the texture of the very long game. The films show you Gandalf's power. They do not have the space to show you the 2,000 years of patient, frightened, faithful labor that power was barely involved in. They cannot show you the decades of watching Bilbo age too slowly and saying nothing. They cannot show you the moment when Gandalf, lying in Lothlorien after his death, felt something he did not quite have a name for, something that called back to a garden he could almost remember, in a world that was no longer his to return to. They cannot show you what it cost to be the being who understood the mission most completely and could not, for 2,000 years, tell anyone what the mission was. And then, after the ring is destroyed, after the war is won, after Frodo is healed and Aragorn crowned, and the long labor of the Third Age brought to its catastrophic completion, Gandalf sails west. He boards the ship at the Grey Havens, with Frodo and Bilbo and the ring-bearers and the last of the elves, and he goes home. This is, on the surface, the happy ending. The divine being returns to Valinor after a successful mission, carrying Narya and the memory of Middle-earth and the long history of what he built there. The body he wore for 3,000 years laid aside, the veil removed, full access to what he is, restored. But Tolkien, who never left an emotional texture unexplored, does not quite let it be simple. Because the things that happened to Gandalf in that body, the things that were real precisely because the body made them real, the love of hobbits, the pleasure of pipe smoke, the specific weight of Frodo's hand in his at the council in Rivendell, the grief when Thorin died under the shadow of the mountain, the joy of unexpected mercy in the most unexpected places, those things are not simply erased when the mission ends. They happened. They happened to a being capable of genuine experience, and they changed him, not away from his nature, into the fullest expression of his nature. He is more fully Olorin, the one who pitied the sorrows of elves for having genuinely suffered among mortals. The Tolkien Catholic intuition here is precise. Grace does not erase experience, it completes it. The wound and the healing and the scar are all part of the same story, and the scar is not less real than the wound because it no longer hurts. Gandalf the Grey, Gandalf the White, Olorin of the Maiar, who was afraid and came anyway, who wore the veil and bore the limitation and lit the small fires that lit the larger ones, who stood on a bridge above a bottomless dark and said, "You shall not pass," not with the confidence of a god who knew he would survive, but with the faith of a servant who knew the line needed holding, whether he survived or not. That being sails home, carrying the world he was given to love. And this is where we reach the thing the story has been building toward this whole time, the place the central question was always pointing, the place that reframes not just Gandalf, but every scene in Middle-earth that features him, every moment of seemingly unnecessary delay, every strategic patience, every firework over the Shire, every choosing of the small road over the direct one. The question was this: if Gandalf had remembered fully, from the first moment he set foot in Middle-earth, exactly what he was, and exactly how the story would end, would his sacrifice have meant the same thing? Does the incarnate veil of forgetting make every act of courage he performed something more, something no purely divine being could have achieved? Early in this story, that question sounded like it might have a philosophical answer, a careful weighing of certainty against faith, of divine foreknowledge against mortal bravery. Now it sounds different. Now it sounds like it might not have an answer at all, and the absence of the answer is not a gap in the argument. It is the argument itself, because what Tolkien was building across the full legendarium, across the Silmarillion and the appendices and the letters and the history of Middle-earth and the single quiet sentence in the Valaquenta about a Maya who pitied the sorrows of elves, was not a fantasy story about good defeating evil. He was building a meditation on the nature of love under limitation, on what it means for a being of any kind, divine or mortal, or somewhere in the long range between them, to choose the long, slow, uncertain, costly way of genuine relationship over the efficient, dominating, certain way of power. He was building the argument that the veil is not the tragedy. The veil is the gift, the partial forgetting, the genuine fear, the mortal-paced work, the love that only becomes possible when you are small enough to be present with the small things. These are not the costs of the mission. They are the mission. The Valar did not send Gandalf to Middle-earth despite his limitation. They sent him because of it, and the limitation was not just the prohibition on domination. It was the body. It was the forgetting. It was the 3,000 years of becoming genuinely, authentically, irreversibly in love with the world he was sent to save. A god cannot love a world the way Gandalf loved the Shire. Not because gods are incapable of love, but because love of this specific kind, the love that shows up every few decades for fireworks and pipe smoke, and the company of creatures who will not live as long as your shortest memory, requires a particular form of choosing to be present in the small things, over and over, without any guarantee of significance. Olorin chose that. He chose it before he ever put on the old man's body. He chose it in the way he walked in Valinor. He chose it in his willingness to be afraid. He chose it in every decade of the Third Age, when the efficient thing would have been to command, and he chose instead to persuade. He chose it in Moria. He chose it in the way he stood at the Grey Havens, and said goodbye to Frodo, and they both knew it was a real goodbye, the kind that cost something, and they said it anyway, because the loving of a thing does not become less real when you understand that it will end. Maybe that is the answer. Maybe the veil did not make his courage something more. Maybe the veil just made his courage visible, made it recognizable as courage rather than as divine certainty dressed up in grey robes, gave it the shape that mortal beings could see and respond to and be inspired by. Maybe what Manwë sent to Middle-earth was not a being powerful enough to win the war. Maybe what Manwë sent was a being humble enough to show the world how to win it for itself. There is a moment, near the end of the Return of the King, that I keep coming back to. Not a dramatic moment, not a battle or a revelation or a confrontation with the powers of darkness. A quiet moment, on the road from the Shire to the Grey Havens, when the four hobbits are riding with Gandalf, and the old wizard is quiet, and the road is long, and the world they are riding through has been saved, but not unmarked, and the cost of it is still being tallied in the specific weight each of them carries. Tolkien does not make much of it. He does not slow down to annotate it. He lets it be a small thing in a large story. But it is there, the old man on the road, going home at last, in the company of the small people he spent 3,000 years loving. If you understand what he is, if you have followed the story all the way down, if you have read the Valaquenta and the Astari and the letters and the history that most people never get to, then that quiet moment on the road is not small at all. It is the whole point. It is a Maya of Valinor, one of the wisest beings in creation, who was afraid and came anyway, who forgot and loved anyway, who was limited and worked anyway, spending the last miles of the last road in the company of the beings he loved best in all the world, with the work done and the fire still burning, and the long rest finally in sight. You shall not pass. He did not say that on the bridge of Khazad-dûm, because he was certain he would win. He said it because some lines have to be held, and because some beings are shaped, at their deepest level, by the willingness to hold them, and because the veil and the body and the fear and the 2,000 years of patient, frightened, faithful labor had made him, more than any divine invincibility ever could have, exactly the right being to stand exactly there, at exactly that moment, and mean it. That is the complete story of Gandalf. Not the wizard with the fireworks and the sharp tongue and the timely arrivals. That story is true, but it is the surface of the water. Underneath it, 3,000 years deep, older than the mountains he walked between, carrying a fear he never quite put down and a love he never once considered setting aside. Olorin, the wisest of the Maiar, the one who pitied most, the one who came. If this hit you the way it hit me, when the full picture finally came together, I genuinely want to know where you land on the question we've been sitting with. Does the forgetting sanctify the courage? Is a divine being capable of mortal faith? Or does the veil have to be real for the faith to be real? There are people in the comments who have been sitting with Tolkien's world their whole lives, and there are people who have just arrived, and both groups see things the other misses. This conversation is worth having. Come have it. And if you want to keep going deeper into the legendarium, into the places where the lore gets strange and beautiful and genuinely unanswerable, stay close. There is much more down here than most people know.